When I was in Wichita a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to the Old Cowtown Museum. Living history town. It's not just an historic site, it shows a frontier settlement, what it would have looked like somewhere between the 1860s to the 1880s. And it's part of the old Chisholm Trail, which was a trail that operated to run cattle to and from Texas and Kansas, but it's really a neat place, and I wanted to walk through some of the cool things I saw while I was there and give you kind of a preview of what you can see if you're going to go and visit it. It's a great place to learn American history and to view open air living history happening in the moment. So when I went there, the first thing we did was you start at the gift shop, and you get to kind of hear a little bit about the story of the old Wichita cowtowns. And then you start, and the first thing you're going to see is one of the Keepers on Parade statues, which was gorgeous. That's one of my favorite pieces. It's very colorful, and that's acknowledging both the history of Wichita and also the native peoples that first started there, that were there before even American conquest and things like that. And so it's meant to be an acknowledgement of that. And it's a kind of a replica, a smaller replica version of the Keeper of the Plains statue, which is kind of iconic in downtown Wichita. And then you start walking through, and the first thing you come on is there are some native teepees, native style teepees. I don't think they're actual real ones, but you'll be able to see that there's native teepees to look like what they would have looked like back in the 1700s, 1800s, meant to kind of help you understand what it would have been like to live in one of those. And as you continue down into the town, just outside of town, we had some living history actors who were demonstrating what it was like to be a cattle boss. And the one who was there that day was a female cattle boss. There was at least one historically who came to Kansas, and there may have been more, but it was very uncommon to have female cattle bosses and cattle drovers. They were not considered really a great part of society, and so they weren't really welcome in the nicer parts of town. Most of the cowhands and cowboys were not welcome in the nicer parts of town, and so the Delano district in downtown Wichita, that's where everybody wanted these people to go. They had their own special spot in town where they could do the things that maybe were not considered polite society. So anyway, we got to hear a little bit of her story. One of the living history demonstrators was there to show us how they would brand cattle. Of course, we didn't use cattle. She showed us how to do it on pieces of wood. But we got to actually use hot poker cattle brand to create our own piece of wood with a cattle brand on it. And that was really cool. You could get the smoke rising, and you had to kind of wiggle it around to make sure it burned properly. And then she also taught us how to use a lariat and how we would rope a calf if we were a cowhand. That was much harder than it looks, let me just say, but it was a really cool experience to be able to try that out. Another thing that we got to do is we went into the print shop where they would have printed the newspaper at the time, and the newspaper was such tiny print. I mean, okay, I don't have to wear glasses yet, but it's coming. However, it was so tiny that even kids would have had a really hard time with it, and adults. But the reason for the tiny print was, of course, the bigger the print was, the less could fit, and so the more expensive it was going to be to print the paper. You wanted to try and get everything onto like one sheet. And so the living history actor who was there was explaining, some of the things from that time period with the newspaper and how expensive it was to have a newspaper. And so newspapers weren't necessarily making a ton of money on the paper itself, but they started being used to print other things like invitations or calling cards to leave with someone when you visited. And we got to print our own souvenir card, which I have still, and I'll show you. But that was really neat to see the process of that and how you would kind of wind it down to make it print, and then it would come back up. And the ink takes about 20 or 25 minutes to fully dry. So we had to be really careful with our cards while we were walking around town. But that was really neat. We also stopped at a seamstress shop, and that was fascinating to see. Not only did I get to try one of the foot pedal singer machines, one of the original kinds that they had before we had electricity, and I was actually kind of good at it because I'm a quilter, and so I know something about how to use a machine to start with. But, all of it was going to be foot powered, and so you could only stitch in one direction, and so it was just a very time-intensive and labor-intensive process. But it was also super interesting to find out, why did these women wear these huge, one of the ladies showed us all the layers, and, when I say showed us, you still didn't see any of her skin. She was showing us all the layers of her dress, and she had 5 or 6 layers under those hoop skirts. And really, it was just vanity. Like, it was fashion just to show that you were rich enough to be able to afford all of that fabric. But I mean, the day we were there, it was 85 degrees and she was sweating. And I cannot imagine on purpose wearing that many layers of clothing just to show someone that I was fashionable. But the bustle, all the layers, the petticoats, everything underneath it was like not made for comfort. It was just for, again, fashion, which not surprising. And the women wanted to wear it because it showed they were well off. So there's that. We also got to stop at the blacksmith shop and see the blacksmith at work. Blacksmith was where you would get all your tools done. So it wasn't just for, like, sometimes I think of it in terms of swordsmanship and stuff, but really it was where you'd go if your plow got broken. A lot of blacksmiths would start to specialize. So they would have wheelwrights who would specialize in making wheels. You could also be a person who would specialize in maybe doing silver stuff. And then there were people who would specialize in horseshoes and horsemanship, and they would be farriers, and they would also be kind of vets as well. So there were a lot of specialties, and blacksmithing was a really important job in the 1800s, all the way up until the modern era, where now a lot of it's done by machine. But as we walked through town, we could see all these old buildings, and we didn't even go inside all of the shops and buildings. There were others we could have visited, but we only had about an hour to be there. And we finished up at the saloon, and we got to have, which was delicious. It's kind of like root beer, but way better. There's also livestock and cattle and farm animals on hand that you can pet and meet. There's a schoolhouse that we didn't get to go into, but I'm told that it has all of the books and slates and things that you would have used in the 1800s in a schoolhouse. And there were some fun kids games outside that we got to try. They usually have a couple of shows a day where they have a shootout in the downtown area on Main Street. We didn't get to see that, but that's something that definitely worth finding out what time it was. But really, just understanding what it was like in the central United States at this time was an amazing experience. It was something that you really start to get a feel for what life would have been like in this town between 1865 to the 1880s. And it's well worth visiting. I highly recommend stopping there if you have never been there before. And I can't wait to go back with my kids so they can see some of the cool stuff that I got to see.